Week 4, we'll be looking at dialectics. Dialectics are basically looking at some pretty standard cultural spectra. So if you're familiar with high context, low context, that would be a big one. Different types, and that would fall under the communication arena. The way people deal with time is a cultural aspect, so we'll look at some differences. And these spectra kind of set up two poles of possibilities, so your very high context or your very low context. And we'll be kind of looking at how those are defined. I think, or what I found in my classes, is that oftentimes, a lot of times we will take one culture, we'll say, okay, Asians are more likely to be high context, and US Americans are more likely to be low context. And traditionally, that's how the dialectics were looked at. I think it's dangerous to make those sorts of generalizations, and I think sometimes they can move into stereotypes, although we're not using them that way. But I think they're still valuable in kind of acknowledging where we would put ourselves on the spectrum, and then recognizing with other types of cultures that the norm would fall somewhere else on that spectrum. And it's not weird, it's just how we were brought up, our different cultural starting points, that sort of thing. So we'll look at those dialectics, and we'll look at some different training exercises that you can use with your learners to explain the dialectics and also have them work with them. Week 5, we're going to look at ways of knowing and learning styles. Some of you may have taken courses that looked at learning styles before, and there are some pretty traditional types of learning styles and types of learning. Like if we look at Bloom's taxonomy, it structures out the different types of learning. We're going to look at that both for a couple of reasons. One, because I think that there are cultural implications in ways of knowing and ways of learning. And even education systems are very different given different cultures in different countries. So we'll look at it from that perspective, but then also it's important to understand different types of learning styles for us as trainers. So when we're designing a training, we're not designing something that only we would be interested in learning. Some people love to learn through lecture. Maybe some of you will love to learn through these videos, and maybe some of you won't. But recognizing that there's a difference, and we need to be open and try to frame and structure some of the training we do to meet different types of learners where they are. Not that we cater everything we do to a certain type of learner, or that everything needs to be experiential or anything like that. A lot of times what we're trying to teach or train on will really dictate that'll really dictate the format that we use to do the training or the exercise or what have you. But it is still important to know about that. Week 6 is actually, if I'm not mistaken, I've set aside as sort of an administrative week. Nope, I lied. I'm just off track. Okay, so week 6 is when we make the transition to looking at training. Week 6 is when we'll start looking at needs assessments and developing learning outcomes. So the real goal will be to understand, sorry, my computer's going to sleep, to understand how you as a trainer can really get to understand the needs of your audience or the needs of your client. One thing I've found in my training experience, both intercultural training and general training that I do for higher ed, my day job, is that a lot of times clients will come to me and they know they have a problem or they know they have a need, but they haven't really defined that need. Or they defined a need, but it's not encompassing the whole thing, or they're missing something they need to do beforehand. So not to dismiss what the client or the audience thinks they need, because I think that's essential. You want to know what they want to know. But to just leave it at that and say, oh, well, they want to know X, but perhaps they didn't understand they needed to know Y first. Probably should have switched those letters around, but so that's why we do a needs assessment and talk to some different people and get a little background, get a little context. You can learn so very much from that sort of thing. So we will look at needs assessments and how to conduct those, and we'll also start talking about learning outcomes. And it looks like actually I have 2 weeks on that, so week 6 and 7. We'll look at needs assessments and developing learning outcomes. Probably week 7 we'll focus more on writing learning outcomes. And those are really essential in training or education of any kind, because that's really where you anchor yourself and that's where you come back to. At the end of the day, you can decide if your training was successful, not if everybody had a good time, but if you met those outcomes or if your learners met those outcomes. So we'll talk about how you write those learning outcomes, how you stay true to them, and all that sort of thing. And then week 8, we get into intercultural training methods and design. At this point, we will have looked at, in terms of methods, we will have looked at a lot of different exercises and tried some in our class. So we won't spend as much time on methods. We'll just look more at what methods are appropriate given your learning outcomes. And we'll look at how you design a program. So once you know your learners, you did the needs assessment, you get it, you've written a learning outcome, you know what goals they want to meet and you know what goals you want them to meet, and you've set it out in stone. How do you design something that allows you to get from there to the actual outcomes? So we'll look at some instructional design and training design. Not that it's very much different, it's the same philosophy. So we will look at design, and then week 9, we look at evaluation and assessment. That comes in very different forms depending on the type of training you're doing. Of course, in this course, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of a train the trainer because it's an intercultural training course that I'm training you on. So clearly in this course, you get grades for all of your assignments. You know how you're doing. That's how we're assessing things. That's how I'm evaluating you to see if you've met the learning outcomes for the course. In my day job, when I'm doing training for clients, people who are paying for that, who are not receiving a grade, I realize that all of you are paying for this course. But in a situation where you have clients who are not receiving grades, are not asking you to assess them, it's still important for you as a trainer to get better yourself and also to do what you said you would do for your client, to find other ways of assessment. And a lot of that will likely be through evaluation. And we'll talk about some of the different ways to evaluate your program, and ways to do it that you're getting kind of the bigger picture. So we'll talk a little bit about triangulating that evaluation, so it's not just getting one survey filled out. Maybe it's a survey and it's a conversation and what have you, to really make sure you're getting the full picture of whether your learners understood, and also looking at continuous evaluation down the road when after people have had a chance to apply what they learned. Oftentimes you can get a better understanding when they've had a chance to apply it of whether you really met those outcomes.